Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we are diving into a stunning geopolitical twist that has sent shockwaves through global power balances, economic strategies, and military alliances. The headline is bold and dramatic for a reason. Ukraine has just destroyed China's $2 billion plan to save Russia, and the consequences could reshape the war, the global economy, and even China's long-term ambitions. To understand how we got here, we need to trace the chain of events from the front lines to the highest levels of international strategy. Because this story is not just about military action, it's also about diplomacy, logistics, technology, and power projection in the modern world. From the very beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China has played a careful and calculated role. Publicly, Beijing claimed neutrality. Privately, it has been one of Russia's most significant lifelines, keeping the Russian economy afloat with trade, technology, and political cover on the global stage. Russia's biggest vulnerability has always been its failing logistics network, its massive losses of equipment, and its inability to produce high-end military technology at scale. China saw an opportunity. By investing billions, it could strengthen Russia, earn leverage over Moscow, and test the West's resolve without getting directly involved in the war. And so came the $2 billion plan, a supposedly civilian infrastructure and industrial partnership, but in reality, a strategic supply chain built to fuel Russia's war machine. This plan included factories on the Russian border, new transportation corridors, dual-use components that could be used in both civilian and military products, and even covert shipments of drones, microchips, and machinery. On paper, it was economic cooperation. In practice, it was China's way of giving Russia a second wind. Beijing believed this strategy would go unnoticed or unchallenged, but Ukraine and its Western allies were watching very closely. What happened next would change everything. Ukraine struck directly at the core of this plan. Rather than targeting only the Russian military, Ukraine started hitting the industrial backbone that supports Russia's war effort. Precision strikes took out factories, warehouses, transportation hubs, and fuel depots, all key parts of the infrastructure China was helping to build. These were not random attacks. Ukraine had intelligence pointing to Chinese-backed projects that were supplying Russia with parts for tanks, drones, and missiles. Each successful strike didn't just damage equipment, it dismantled months of planning and billions in investment. Suddenly, China's quiet assistance was no longer safe. Beijing expected trade routes and infrastructure to be protected deep inside Russian territory. But Ukraine proved it could reach them with long-range drones and Western-supplied missiles. One of the most significant blows was to the logistics networks in Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk. These regions were supposed to become secure corridors where Chinese goods could flow into Russia, bypassing Western sanctions. Instead, Ukrainian strikes turned them into hazardous zones. Rail lines were cut. Storage depots were destroyed. Equipment bound for the front never arrived. Russia's already strained supply chain started to crack even further. For China, this was a disaster. Billions invested in infrastructure were suddenly worthless. Factories couldn't operate if they were being bombed. Transport routes couldn't function if they were constantly targeted. China tried to shift operations deeper into Russia, but even those areas were no longer safe thanks to Ukraine's expanding reach. At this point, Beijing realized something critical. The West was now targeting Chinese involvement directly. European and American intelligence agencies began exposing Chinese companies that were supplying Russia. Sanctions followed. Chinese banks started freezing transactions to avoid being punished, and suddenly the $2 billion plan to quietly rescue Russia became a global scandal. China found itself in a dangerous position. If it continued helping Russia, it risked massive economic damage from Western sanctions, far worse than anything it gained from supporting Moscow. But if it backed off, Russia would weaken further, limiting China's strategic influence in Eurasia and damaging their so-called no-limits partnership. Meanwhile, Ukraine's strikes were becoming even more successful because of Western intelligence sharing and advanced weaponry like ATACMS, Storm Shadow, and long-range drones. But it wasn't just equipment. Ukraine also launched special operations across the border, sabotaging factories and energy infrastructure connected to China's supply chain. These missions were risky, but incredibly effective. Within months, China's entire strategy of using Russia as a proxy to challenge the West was collapsing. The biggest blow came when Ukraine destroyed a major industrial facility believed to be producing drone engines using Chinese machinery. Satellite images showed the facility in flames. Analysts confirmed critical components were from Chinese firms. This was the turning point. The message to China was clear: if you secretly build Russia's war machine, we will destroy it. Even more damaging was the psychological impact. Russia, once seen as a great military power, couldn't protect its own infrastructure, even with China's help. This made Moscow look weak and unreliable as a partner. Other countries that considered aligning with Russia and China started hesitating. Nobody wants to bet on the losing side. China now faced a dangerous dilemma: double down and risk direct confrontation with the West, or retreat and leave Russia to its fate. For a country obsessed with long-term strategy, this was humiliating. Beijing tried to rebrand its involvement as peace efforts and called for negotiations, but everyone saw through it. China wanted peace only because its investment was being blown up. This situation also revealed just how powerful Ukraine has become in modern warfare. Despite being smaller and heavily outnumbered, it has used intelligence, precision weapons, and strategic targeting to disrupt the plans of not just Russia, but also China, one of the world's biggest powers. That is historic. Never before has a country in active war successfully dismantled a covert economic military alliance between two major powers. But why exactly did China think this plan would work? Because for years the world underestimated Ukraine. Beijing assumed that as long as fighting stayed near the front lines, deep infrastructure inside Russia would be safe. That assumption was destroyed the moment Ukraine hit oil refineries and military plants far from the border. China also assumed the West would avoid escalation. But after seeing China help Russia bypass sanctions, the US and Europe began tightening controls, targeting banks, shipping companies, and supply lines. In other words, China tried to build a shadow economy to save Russia, and Ukraine dragged it into the light and shattered it. Now, let's talk about the long-term consequences. First, China's image as an untouchable rising superpower has been damaged. It spent billions, and Ukraine destroyed it without even touching Chinese territory. Second, Russia is more isolated than ever. It is losing soldiers, tanks, missiles, and now even its secret lifeline from China. Third, the West has proven it will not allow any country to prolong this war from the shadows. If you help Russia, you will be exposed, sanctioned, and targeted. Finally, Ukraine has shown the world that intelligence and precision matter more than raw numbers. You don't always need millions of troops. You need strategy, technology, and the courage to strike where it hurts most. As we look forward, the story is far from over. China still wants influence. Russia still wants victory. Ukraine still wants liberation. The West still wants stability. The battlefield is changing, not just on land, but in trade, technology, and global power structures. One thing is certain: Ukraine has proven it is not just fighting for survival, it is shaping the future. China thought it could quietly reshape the war. Instead, Ukraine just destroyed that plan, and in doing so, sent a message to the entire world. Even the biggest powers can be outsmarted. And that is why this moment will be remembered as a turning point in modern history.